Iranian armament that is being sent from Tehran. Because when we discuss this issue, we should remember that there is this very frightening ideology, very extremist ideology of destabilizing the whole Middle East in order to have an Iranian hegemony over the Middle East, over what we have today in Gaza, in Lebanon, in the territories, maybe one day, in their view, in Israel, and over all the other Arab regimes in the Middle East, the less extremist ones, from the Gulf up to Morocco in the other side of the world, that doesn't have, by the way, today diplomatic relations with Iran because of this kind of infiltration. And we have this very problematic Iranian ideology that is threatening all of us, Israel first and foremost.
Yeah, I mean, talking about Iran, I mean, one thing that's been really interesting over the last couple of months, really, going back to the winter of 2010, has been the WikiLeaks affair. And we've actually seen through WikiLeaks, really, that the Egyptian government and also some of the Gulf states has declared that Iran poses an existential threat. We've had King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia saying that he would like to see that he wants the Americans to cut the head off the snake. I mean, it's almost echoing the same words as Israel's been talking about years of the existential threat of Iran, with Iran acquiring nuclear weapons. Now, are we reaching a stage where, as time passes, that diplomatic opportunity or the opportunity to put sanctions on Iran to prevent them from acquiring nuclear weapons is beginning to fail? And are we now entering a stage where the only option left is a military option to deal with Iran's nuclear weapons program that poses a threat not only to Israel but to the entire Middle East?
I would say to the entire world. I will remind you, first and foremost, in a way, I totally agree with what WikiLeaks is saying. I served in Jordan and I heard it myself. And more than that, I remind you that the Iranians were producing terror acts, whether in Germany a few years ago, around a decade ago, and even in Argentina, in the other side of the world, twice at least, in which more than 100 people died, not to mention what they're doing in the Middle East. So I think that the Iranian issue is not an Israeli issue. In a way, it's not even a regional issue. You're totally right. Those countries are seeing the Iranian threat as an existential one. The Gulf countries, but even countries that are further away to the west. But I think that Iran is problematic to the whole world, and the whole international community should deal with this. I think that we still have some, I would say, weapons in our hands that are civilian weapons, that are not explosive weapons, that can be used towards Iran. And I'm speaking about diplomacy, I'm speaking about economics, I'm speaking about the ability of crippling sanctions to persuade the Iranian regime and maybe the Iranian people that this is not worthwhile, that they should try another way. We know that there are some leaders in Iran and some people in the other levels of the Iranian society that are not very happy with what is happening. I think that what the international community should do is to try and to multiply the rate and the energy that is being given to these crippling sanctions, as I said, in order to make the Iranian regime feel that there is a payment to be paid. Again, not in order to save Israel only, and not in order to save the regimes in the Middle East only, but to save the whole world, because what Iran is putting forward is a real threat to the values and to the ways in which this world is going forward. And I do hope that this world is going forward, even though some Iranians would like it to go to the other side.
But also, isn't there a danger here as what's happening now, because Iran is developing their own nuclear weapons program, and they are the world's #1 sponsor of international terrorism, supporting Hamas and Hezbollah, and even cultivating new leadership of Al-Qaeda after the war in Afghanistan, after 9/11, that what we're seeing now, because the Iranians are developing nuclear weapons, and because of WikiLeaks been made public, the Arab fears of Iran acquiring nuclear weapons, they themselves now are looking to acquire nuclear weapons. And how would Israel cope with this one? It surely leads to a proliferation of nuclear weapons in the most volatile region of the world, and increases the possibility that Al-Qaeda or Islamic fundamentalist terrorist organisations such as Hezbollah or Hamas could actually get their hands on nuclear material.
I think that the world is very much aware to the danger of proliferation, internal nuclear proliferation within the Middle East. I think this is one of the most acute problematics that Iran is posing to the international community by dismantling some of the international mechanisms that the world has built for years and years, for decades, in order to make sure that we don't have a world that is full of nuclear weapons in the head of crazy countries. Unfortunately, the Iraqi example from more than 10 years and the actual present Iranian example show that these countries are signing agreements and never really honoring the signature on those agreements. Iran has no problem to sign the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty, and on the same hand trying to enrich and to build a nuclear bomb in order to have this hegemonial thing. And I do agree with you that if we are going to let Iran continue with the nuclear program, we might have a very acute danger of proliferation, nuclear proliferation in the Middle East, out of which not just Al-Qaeda but other organizations in the world are looking very happily in a way and are waiting to see whether the chance to put a hand on nuclear or biological or chemical warhead or capability is possible. And we are not talking only on Al-Qaeda and the Islamic, the very extreme Islamic, I would say, gangs that we see today. We are talking about other parts of the world with more normal organizations that might be very happy to use these things in the future.
I mean, in Britain, we've seen the rise of the delegitimization of Israel. It's almost become an industry here. And the Israeli Defense Minister Ehud Barak recently described the threat of the delegitimization of Israel as Israel's second existential threat. Can you tell us what the delegitimization of Israel actually means, and also what can be done to actually stop it?
I thought at first that delegitimization is difficult and is dangerous because you can't pronounce it. But no, I'm joking. Delegitimization is, I would say today, the worst problem that Israel has to face. And to say the truth, it is something that is really very problematic for an Israeli diplomat, and not just for an Israeli diplomat, for an Israeli citizen to understand. I mean, when I look on Israel, and I lived most of my life in Tel Aviv, for example, I see a very democratic, liberal, vibrant society that finds room for everyone, whether Jews and Christians and Muslims and Arabs and immigrants that are coming from all around the world, from Russia and from Ethiopia and from elsewhere, and are creating this wonderful society in which everyone can find himself a place, in which you have human rights, in which you have rule of law, in which you have sometimes too much vibrant democracy, and values. This is the most important point, values. And when I look at what is happening and how Israel is demonized in some parts of the world and in some entities here and there that are calling Israel with terrible names, that are saying that Israel is not a democracy, that are calling for boycotting Israel. And I'm looking at that, you know, not even as an Israeli diplomat, as an Israeli young citizen, asking myself, this is not the country I know. And what is very interesting is whenever people are visiting Israel, and when they are coming back, they are saying, this is not what we thought. Your society is such open, so liberal, so lively. We can't understand why is this delegitimization of Israel is happening. But in a way, it is happening. And I think that everyone that knows that Israel is different should open his mouth, should voice his ideas, because unfortunately we hear only those who demonize. And I think that there are a lot of people who know for sure what Israeli is like, far away from the demonizing creature,